So we're in a series called Stronger, and we're looking at strength, so that video does actually play in a little bit. And we're going to speak into that in a moment, but we just want to pray for men. We want to pray for fathers, spiritual fathers, those desiring to be fathers. Really, if you're a man, we want to pray for you, and we want to give you a boerewors roll. So if you, good reason to stand. If you don't mind standing, and we're going to stretch out our hands to you, and we just think of everyone online as well. And for some of us, Father's Day is about memories, and we don't get to celebrate it with fathers near or children near, and so we're aware of that. But in that all, we just want to recognize God's presence and that He's here with us in the moment as our good Father. So let me pray. Father, I just thank you for your presence here. As Marilyn has already said, that in your presence there is fullness of joy. In moments where we even feel hopeless, you are the God of all hope. And so in you we encounter hope. And I just pray for every father here. I pray for grace. I pray for your favor upon them. I pray for wisdom. I pray for capacity. I pray for prophetic foresight to be able to speak words of life over daughters and sons and spiritual family. I thank you, Lord, for these men that instill character and identity and security and courage and ignite dreams and possibilities in people's lives. And we just bless them to be that blessing that they are in Jesus' mighty name. Amen. Luke, there's still many years ahead of you, but I appreciate that you stood. You get your boerewors roll. So really, we want to just welcome you all, and especially men, we want to honor you, and we're just so grateful that you're here today. And Clint and Michelle, great to have you in the house. If you know them, just show them some love. If you don't know them, you should get to know them. So find them afterwards. Wonderful to see them here. But we're in a series called Stronger, and last week we looked at Gideon. And we're just trying to see where there's these men and women. As we look throughout Scripture, and we've been in the Old Testament, we'll get to the New, but where we see these men and women where God has moved mightily upon them, strengthened them for purpose and for kingdom advancement, and what that means, what we can learn from them, what we can glean from them, the type of strength they operated in, how they accessed it, and how they released it. And so that's what we're busy looking at today. And we know that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Isn't that good? It means that as we read these scriptures, they're not history. They're present moment for today, for this week, for the months ahead. They're for us. We don't read like people getting a history lesson. We read like, and Mark Driscoll said this, I love it, we read like special forces ready to go on assignment. And so when we read about these men and women, it's speaking about what God is wanting to do today in your life and mine. So we're going to read about the heroes of the faith, but the invitation is for us to step out in heroic faith when we know that it doesn't rely on us and our capacity and ability, but on our capacity and ability to trust in His faithfulness. And so let's jump into Hebrews 11, verse 32. This is our foundational verse in this series, and it says, "And what more shall I say? I do not have the time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith," listen to these things that happened, "who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, who quenched the fury of the flames, who escaped the edge of the sword." And now this is the part that we're leaning into. It's one for men, as you can read these verses for Father's Day, "whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies." So the result of this strength was that they became powerful, and they were able to overcome the enemy, all the attack and onslaught that he brought, and they were able to take ground for the king and the kingdom. And God is able to take those weak places where we feel, I don't have the capacity. Maybe it's in business, maybe it's in being a husband, maybe it's in being a son, maybe it's in, I don't know what area it is for you, but God is able to take those places where we feel weak and to turn them into strength to display His grace in and through our lives. That's the beauty of what we see unfolding here. That's what happened with Gideon, where this transformational power started to work in his life. And today we're going to encounter it with David. But before we get there, just to recap, last week we saw that this whole concept was of weakness becoming strength. And weakness in the Greek, we had seen it meant two things. It meant bodily weakness, where we feel feeble and we don't have strength, but it also meant soulish weakness, where we feel we didn't have capacity to endure. How many of us are in the workplace or wherever we might be, and we just feel, I don't have capacity. It's Monday, it's coming this week. I don't have the ability to endure what I'm going through relationally, whatever it might be. And this scripture, what it's saying is it's taking the concept of this bodily and this soulish weakness and saying in a moment with God or through a process, because it happens differently with different individuals, He can work it to strength so that something powerful can take place. And in this passage, the word strength there is the word endunameo, and it means to fill with power to turn to strength. It's about face. I was in weakness and now I'm in strength. And this is what God does in our lives. Not through our wisdom, not through our planning, not through our sabbaticals, not through going to the spa or to the game reserve, although those things are great. It's not through that, it's through His working. And we're going to look at David, as I've said, and many of us know David was the king of Judah. He was the king of Israel. He was positioned for the throne to lead Israel in one of its most glorious moments. But even in the midst of that, the thing that really defined him was that he was a man after God's own heart. And so there's something we're going to glean from him here today, that there's something of how he accesses strength and how he lives in that strength, that if we embrace, it won't just impact you, it won't just impact your family, but we love that it does, but it can impact this world at large. So let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 30. And we're looking, and we see that it's about David and his mighty men, and they've been out fighting, they've been in battle, they had left their women and the children at the camp, and there's this passage that I'm going to highlight. What we see happening is, while they've been out warring, the Amalekites have come in, and they've kidnapped all of their women, all of the children, all of their families' possessions have been taken. And we're going to pick up here, just to see how David handles himself. Verse 6. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and daughters. We can understand what that is as we celebrate in the midst of Father's Day. And it says, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And I know that most of us have heard that before, but I really want us to look at it with fresh eyes this morning. In the King James it says, and David encouraged himself in the Lord. This was David's strength. Not what he accomplished, it's how he strengthened himself, because that was his strength in any moment, any given day. And so today's title is The Strength to Encourage Yourself. And this has profound meaning for me this week, because my youngster, Mitchell, he's 7, he's up in kids' church at the moment. And this week, he's just been going through I think he had been on my iPad and YouTube and seen about poisonous this and that. And so he's been needing a bit of reassurance and asking, is this poisonous, that poisonous? And Leanne and I have witnessed it just in the last week. And so I took a moment where I just got him and I just started to speak words over him and say, you know, you're courageous, you're a boy, you're adventurous, we love you. There's so much for you. You must just go out, have fun, take rides. I was just trying to speak life into him. So that night, I'm watching TV. He's going up to bed, up the stairs, and he comes down after being in bed. He leaves the room, and he comes out, and he says to me from the stairs, he says, and while I'm watching Seinfeld, it's very important for some reason. Someone needs to hear that. No, I'm joking. So he says to me, he says, Dad, when I'm older, I'm going to need you to encourage me. So you mustn't leave Harvest. So I'm like thinking, well, what's happening here? What do I not know about? I go up to Leanne, I say, did he say this to you? And she said, yes, exactly like that. Trying to figure out what he's thinking and saying. And the next morning, I was able to get it out of him. And he's saying that like his older sister, who's now living in Alaska. Not living in Alaska. Living in, she's all over America. She's in Arizona currently, studying in California. But like his older sister, who's on the far ends of the world, he's going to need encouragement one day. And he had come across, even though he came across the thing that discouraged him, he had come across a video clip, which we do, and we live at the moment, of me preaching. And he thought, you need to stay at Harvest, so wherever I'm in the world, I can be encouraged. 7 years old. Yeah, blessed is my heart. But I want him to get to the place where, and I love that he sees that in me, but I want to direct him to the Father's heart. where he doesn't need YouTube and he doesn't need an iPad and he doesn't need to worry about any of those things, because he's always able to access the presence, the person of God, and to find encouragement and strength for the moment and the moments ahead. And so that's what I want us to glean as we read through this passage together and pull out just some truths that I believe are hidden here, how we can allow ourselves to be encouraged in God and have the ability to encourage ourselves. That's what we see with David. Even as we look at this word encourage, there's two parts to it. And when it says en, the beginning of that word, en, it means this. If you look in the dictionary, it means to place, to attach, to implant. So when you're encouraging someone, what you are doing, you are implanting courage into someone else. You're putting courage into them. And the opposite of that is discourage. And when you look at that word dis, and I know it's used quite widely in common vernacular, but when you look at it, it means to apart, to remove, to take out. So when you encourage someone, you are putting courage into them. And when you discourage, you are taking courage out of people. And this is happening all the time, where we find people where we are being discouraged, we are finding courage going out of us, and the automatic humanistic response in the midst of that moment is, I'm going to go looking for courage anywhere, any place, anyhow I can get it, and I'm going to try and take it so I can put it back into me. And so we see this happening all over, people searching for encouragement. And you can be searching through other people, you can be searching through social media, you can be searching through success or money or a whole list of things. You can be looking for something to fill that emptiness. But I love that David had found the place, the person, where he had the ability to step out and encourage himself in the Lord. And what would it look like if we began to do it? Can you imagine? As I've said, the impact on you, on your family, and further afield. If we believe that we have this capacity, this strength to do what David does, we have the capacity to learn to strengthen ourselves and encourage ourselves in the Lord, that at any given moment we have the ability to draw on what he is wanting to make available to us in our own lives. And maybe you're thinking, well, George, how does that play out? And give me an example. Well, let me give you an example of maybe experiencing people looking for courage. Do you know someone? And don't elbow the person on your left or look at the person on your right, but whenever they are around you, you feel completely and utterly drained. Do you have any of those relationships? I'm not picking on them. There's a reason. Most likely that person is discouraged, and most likely they're coming to you to pull courage. Warren, I want to just affirm you in that. You are an encourager. I see people going to you all day long, not because of the prophetic gift, which is so accurate, because of your character and who you are. You're a source of stability and strength. You're a source of courage and hope to others. And I just want to affirm you in that. But you get people that happens, and it happens on a regular basis. I don't want to discount that, because even as I've affirmed Warren in that, I believe we are meant to be doing it. But what I'm saying is you need to know the location you are going to get courage. If you are going to other people consistently, you need to realize maybe I'm being a bit of a drain and maybe I'm needing to add a bit of courage. Don't always take. But to do that, you need to find courage. And you need to find courage in the Lord. And so it's about finding that place in him. And with David, there are 3 scenarios I want to highlight. Normally I do 4 points, it's just 3. And in these 3 points, these 3 scenarios, I trust you can find yourself. Maybe previously, maybe this present moment, maybe you're going to be landing up in it later, where you're going to find yourself here and you can see, as David carried himself, how you can also have strength in your life to draw from the Lord. So number 1, David strengthened himself in his desires. David had to strengthen himself because of his desires. We can put that on the screen. Because sometimes our timing is not God's timing. We've got desires, we've got dreams, and we've got aspirations. And when our timing doesn't match up with his, we need to strengthen ourselves, otherwise we'll become discouraged. And David has this happening all day long. There's this rhythm of waiting where his timing doesn't look to be as sharp and on point as the Lord's for him. And we can read it from 1 Samuel 13 all the way to 2 Samuel chapter 5. And it's that phrase, he epitomizes it, waiting for it. He's waiting for it. Let's look at him just briefly. We don't know the exact age where he was anointed to be king, but we know that the theologians will say he was a boy or a young teenager. But we do have a more informed timeline of when of the waiting period before he became king. So we don't know when he was anointed, but when he became king, supposedly it was around 15 years after he was anointed. Then he became king of Judah. It was another 7 years before he became king of Israel. So that's 20 years in total that he's waiting from the moment he's anointed for a task and thinking, this is awesome, I'm stepping into destiny, to actually stepping into the moment of being Israel's destined king. And here's the thing, he had to fight discouragement through that process because he was promised something that he was not seeing the fulfillment of yet. How many of you feel discouraged because you feel you've been promised something in God or whatever it might be in the workplace or in a relationship, but you are not seeing the fulfillment of it yet, and you've been waiting long, and the waiting has got long. And David, the way he had handled this is you'd see him throughout the Psalms, and he would burst, this expression of his heart would be bursting out, and he would pour out this discouragement, not at God, but before God. He would be in this place where he would cry out to the Lord, like we saw in that video clip, Dad, Dad, Dad. And we saw the different degrees of it. He would do it in these different moments. Psalm 13, verse 1. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? He's calling out to God, crying out to God. How long will you hide your face from me? So he's showing that even in the waiting, even though he knows he can go to God, there's a pain in the waiting. He had waited on Saul. He had waited on his earthly father Jesse. He had waited on the prophet to arrive. He had waited for the moment against Goliath. He had waited to become king of Judah. He had waited to become king of Israel. There's this waiting that's been happening. But I want us to get this, that David, eventually he gets to this promise. But David didn't learn to strengthen himself in the Lord in the palace. He learned to strengthen himself in the Lord in the field. Amongst that moment that he thought he was trying to get beyond and trying to get to lead away from. And here's the thing, even when he was anointed king, he had to go back and tend to sheep. I mean, how frustrating is that? You think the moment's come, you're anointed, and he had to go back. But I believe that it was during this waiting process, it was in the midst of his desires not yet meeting their full expectation, that God really began to minister deeply into him about how to strengthen himself in the Lord, and not a position, and not a title, and not a throne, and not a role, and not recognition, and not affirmation of a nation, but in the Lord. Something personable was happening in that moment. And I believe that even as I've spoken about my points, I believe David loved points. And if he was here today, he would have 2 sub-points to my point. Now, you mathematicians will work and recognize that's not 3 points, it's 5. But stay with me. So maybe my maths is wrong because no one agreed. Rob, you'll have to catch me on that one. But here's the 2 sub-points, the things that helped him while he waited. So, A, this is the first one. The first thing we see, and this doesn't sound glamorous, you have to embrace being a nobody. When you've got a desire, when you feel a sense of calling and a sense of destiny to be someone and become someone, in the moment you are currently in, you have to embrace being a nobody. When David was tending sheep, he was a nobody, but it was in the season of being a nobody that God was making him into somebody. Don't miss what God's doing in this season. Don't be dreaming of the next moment and not partnering in this moment. And he had to embrace this, even when he was brought in to be king, even when he was anointed to be king. Here's the amazing thing. Samuel comes and says, "Oh, are these all the sons you have?" And Jesse replies, "Oh, they're still the youngest." I mean, he didn't even seem worthy enough to be mentioned by name. His dad didn't think that in this moment he wasn't the best father on Father's Day, that his youngest son was worth even being at the ceremony. You just leave him with the sheep. And he had to live in this moment of desire not being realized, of being a nobody, but it was in the moment of being a nobody that God was making him into somebody, because something was taking place in the midst of the seeming vacuum. And we need to embrace the season of waiting on the Lord. We need to embrace the season when our desire is not yet met or fulfilled. And David is embracing this. The second thing, after embracing being a nobody, which no one really celebrated the whole point of, but point number 2, this one you might not want to celebrate as well. Stay planted. Stay planted. As I've said, he's been anointed as king. There might be things going through his head of what the moment should look like, but he would say to you, you need to stay. You need to remain. You need to be satisfied. You need to be content. You need to be where God has you to be in this season. Be there. Be present. Allow him to presence himself in the midst of that moment. Because after he was anointed king, he went back to the old job. He went back to tending sheep. He went back to looking after the flock. That was his assignment in that moment, to shepherd a flock. But what God was doing was preparing him to shepherd Israel. But he had to be faithful in that moment to receive the fullness of the moment to come. And so stay planted. There's assignment in where God has you. And so all of a sudden you could look at this, and I'm sure David thought, when he was anointed, I've become somebody. But here's the challenge. In our desire to become somebody, we can find that instead of going somewhere in the midst of that moment, we're going nowhere. He had become someone and anointed to be king in front of his brothers and dad. But even with that, he was going nowhere quickly. He was having to stay where he was. And this art works where he's having to tend the sheep, as I said. And I'm convinced, if you find yourself in the moment, I'm just where I was and doing what I initially was doing, I'm convinced that God was doing his greatest work in the field that would be put on display in the palace. But it was happening right there. So what do you do in this season? You don't go looking out for the next job. You don't go looking out for the next relationship. You don't start spying out someone else's field thinking the grass looks greener. David tended the flock that he had before God gave him the next flock. There was something happening, being nurtured in the tendering. And you have to be disciplined in this. I need to be disciplined in this. In the season that you're waiting, where you feel like your desires are not being met, stay planted because God knows where to find you. Stay in your assignment. God knows where to find you. God finds his children in the place of their last assignment. When he wanted to find David again for the moment, because the moment comes, he didn't have to run to every field wondering where this person would be. He knew he would find him where he had left him, to pick up where he had been faithful in that assignment, to be accelerated into the next assignment. And so there's something about staying planted. God knows exactly where you are. And when God came to look for David, David was ready because something had been forged in him for the moment to come of fortitude. So let me say again, God finds his children in the place of their last assignment. And the best thing that you can do in this current assignment is to finish it well. Finish the current season you're in well. Embrace being a nobody, embrace being planted, and allow God to work in that. Because let me tell you, him looking after sheep, him facing lion and bears, wasn't his delay, it was his development. It wasn't denying his destiny, it was defining what his destiny would look like. And so he had to honor and take hold of that moment. Okay, the second scenario that we can jump into is David had to strengthen himself when it came to his distress. He had to strengthen himself when it came to his distress. And distress looks like this, when your way doesn't look like God's way in that moment. Saying, on Lord, this is my way, and this is what I've planned, and it doesn't really look like your way, and so I'm feeling distressed. What happens in the midst of that moment, distress refers to extreme sorrow. We can get hopeless. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. Extreme sorrow or pain. And most sorrow or pain that we experience in our hopes and our desires and our dreams is the result of something not going according to the way that you expected it to go. And so you land up in this position. Let's see this. 1 Samuel 30:1-6. Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag. There's some big words in this passage. And had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off, and all went their way. Carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burnt with fire, and their wives, their sons, their daughters had been taken captive. Think about that. Their wives, their sons, their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people that were with them lifted their voices, and they wept until there was no strength in them to weep. I don't know if I've ever wept quite like that, to the point where I have no more strength to weep anymore. Maybe when I watched Paul Potts on America's Got Talent, maybe then. Number 5. Now David's 2 wives have been taken captive. Hear the words. Anomi, the Jezreelitess, I got it, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. Well done, George. Moreover, David was greatly distressed. He was in a moment of distress, extreme sorrow and pain, because the people spoke of stoning him, For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and daughters. Here it is, in the midst of that moment, in the midst of that distress, in the midst of that pain, in the midst of that sorrow, what we can learn from David is not the outworking. We know he's going to go after the enemy. He's going to rally his men. He's going to see through the moment. He's going to wipe out the enemy. He's going to get his children, the sons, the daughters, the possessions, and more back. It's all going to happen. But it's not about what he accomplished. It's about what he did that put strength in his life in this moment. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. That's the key part we need to pull from this. How does that happen? How does he strengthen himself? I believe it's actually summed up in that verse. Sorry, that text quite small as I look at it there. Here's the first aspect that I feel, the 2 key points. The first aspect is this, and I know we had some real estate people here in the first service, and you might know this phrase. It's location, location, location. And I just want to join this to David strengthening himself, because it's location, location, location. Even in real estate, location is all that matters. Strengthening yourself in the Lord, location is all that matters. And there's something happening here that David has caught on to. And David knew this is where I go to encourage myself. And this word "in" is so significant. If I had to say to you that I had fun in Disneyland with my family, my son Luke lost his voice because he was screaming like a man on all the rides. Told me afterwards it's more fun if you scream, so you did it well. You must have had lots of fun. But if I say we had fun in Disneyland, I'm saying we had fun where? In Disneyland, the resort. There's something there about location that matters. And David's saying, I figured out the secret of strengthening myself, of encouraging myself. And it's all about my location. What I do is I remove myself from the location of my distress, spiritually. In the soulish and the physically, you might be there, but I'm going to remove myself. But actually, sometimes physically, you need to remove yourself as well. But I remove myself from the location of distress, and I position myself, and I make my location in the Lord. That's where this starts. That's where this goes. That's where I'm going to find my encouragement. And so that's what David does. And you can allow this concept to play out. I mean, you can look at it and self-analyze. If you're discouraged, let me ask you, what are some locations you've been spending time in? If you're feeling now that you are a little bit distressed, where are you spending time? Or you may be spending time with people who are drawing, taking, never giving back, and who are discouraging you. That might be where you are. Or maybe you're in a season where you just feel that not even that you feel like you. If I had to take your phone and look at it, you don't feel like you need to be spending time, but you are spending copious amount of time there. If I look through your phone's history, and maybe if I look at where the location of where you've been spending time is, in News 24 or the Sharks rugby website. Oh, no, I'm joking. I love the Sharks. We've said this last week. But maybe that's going to reveal why you're feeling discouraged. It has to do with your location. Because if you allow your mind to linger longer in those locations, let me tell you, when you go to those locations, you'll always find what you're looking for. So you better know, what am I looking for? Because that'll define the locations that you're going to be heading to. And if you're encouraged and feeling great, I want to tell you to stop there. Don't just think I'm feeling great. Stop there and use what psychologists call metacognition, where you start to think about what you're thinking about. Because most likely you're spending time in places that are putting courage into you. And you need to make those not momentary, but habits. So if you're discouraged, ask yourself, what have I been thinking? Where have I been? Who have I been hanging out with? What locations am I frequenting? What am I watching? What news am I reading? What am I ingesting? What am I spending my time doing? And if you're encouraged, just start to look and say, what is putting courage into me? Possibly you are praying and spending time communing and interacting with God. Because what fathers do is they instill identity, they instill strength, and they instill courage. And so maybe you've been doing that. Maybe you've been spending time in worship. Because it's hard to sing that song that, well, I don't even remember the words now. It's hard to remember the words as well as to sing it. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It's hard to sing that and not to feel courage coming back into your life. It's hard not to feel encouraged when you are spending time with people of faith. So you start to look at those things and you start to say, what do I want to put into my life? Because that's location of where I'm going to be spending time. So location, location, location. The second thing I want to say, it's relationship, relationship, relationship. This is what we see unfolding here. David strengthened himself where? Location, in the Lord. Through what? And I often miss this word as I read it, but these next two words, because I look at David strengthened himself in the Lord, that's location, but it continues to say, his God, my God. When I say that Leanne is my wife, I'm not saying that it's not a possessive phrase. I'm not saying that I own her any more than David is saying that he owns God. That's not what's being said here. It's not possessive, but it is a relational phrase. My God, his Lord. And those two ingredients, being encouraged because of location and relationship, are what David was discovering through all of these scenarios that we're talking about, where he was taking himself out of discouragement and distress. He was positioning himself in the place of encouragement, in the Lord, in the presence of God, in the presence of the body of Christ, in the midst of worship. He was positioning himself intentionally, and that all took place in relationship. So those two words there, his God, are so key. And as I've said, I don't think that relationship was being formed in the palace. I don't think that relationship was formed when he was king. I believe that relationship was being formed in the loneliness of the field, where he was in that place where he was a season of feeling, I'm a nobody in this moment, where he was in the season of feeling, I'm not noticed. But in that season, he was staying planted, and God was able to work something in him and forge something in him that when the distress came, when the most challenging seasons of his life came, he knew how to handle those moments because of what God had been doing, and to encourage himself in the Lord. And then the third thing I want to say is this. David had strengthened himself in his desires when his time didn't match up with God. He strengthened himself in his distress when it wasn't happening the way that he thought it should happen. And he strengthened himself when things were dire. You know, desires is quite good. Distress gets a little bit heavier, but desire is a whole nother word. Dire is a whole nother word. What does this mean? It means this. It means to be in a situation or event that causes you great anxiety, fear, or worry. That's a dire situation. So a dire situation, and this is when it unfolds, if we can put it on the screen, it's when your thinking is not God's thinking. We find ourselves in those dire situations, anxiety, fear, and worry. Really, it's speaking about mental health. And we find ourselves in the negative aspect of mental health when our thinking doesn't align with God's. And it doesn't align with God's thinking about you. Then we can find our mental health under attack. And so let's just jump into a second story to see this unfold. 2 Samuel 24, verse 10. And it's a moment in David's life when here's a man who's pursuing God's own heart, but he displeases God. And we know there was the moment with Bathsheba, but this is another moment where before Moses had taken a census of the people of Israel, and God said, hey, Moses, they're not your people, they're my people. So when you count them and take a census, be sure to give me an offering so that it'll go well with you. And David decides, Lord's led me in victory. He's given me great authority and a realm and all of this. But you know what? I'm not going to consult or inquire of the Lord, which he normally did. But instead, I'm going to take a census of Israel to know my strength. And so he does that without inquiring of the Lord, without the Lord commanding him. And because of that, he displeases the Lord, and he realizes it. So it says this, it says in verse 10, but after he had taken the census, David's conscience began to bother him. And he said to the Lord, I've sinned greatly by taking the census. Please forgive my guilt, Lord, for doing this foolish thing. Next morning, the prophet arrives. This is Old Testament. There were consequences arriving quite rapidly. So the prophet Gad arrives, and he says this. And this is the dire situation he's in. The prophet Gad arrives and he says, you've got three choices that are going to outwork from this moment. And say, listen, it's like Jeopardy, that game. You've got to be attentive here. He says, choice number one, you can choose for there to be a famine in the land. It's going to last 3 years. David's thinking, let's go for door number two. Choice number two, you can spend 3 months fleeing from all of your enemies. And David's thinking, 3 years, 3 months. Now let's go door number three. Door number three, you can choose a plague breaking out in the entire nation for 3 days. Now you've got 3 years, 3 months, 3 days. And you might think, hey, he's just worked it down numerically and he's gone for the least amount of time. But that's not what's informing David's decision in a dire situation where he's maybe worried or anxious and pain. He's saying this, I'm not going to choose another army to chase us because I'm not going to trust in that leader and how he will be to us. I'm not going to trust myself in a famine because I'll have to rely on my neighbors, and my trust isn't that great in my neighbors. What I'm going to do, even in this dire situation, even when it seems the Lord is not pleased for me, I'm still going to believe that He's got the best intentions, that His Father heart is towards me, and that discipline's going to be productive. So what I'm going to do is I'm not putting my hand in any man's hand. I'm going to put myself in his. And so he pushes and positions himself into the hand of God. But this is what he says in verse 14. You see this dire situation. He says, I am in a desperate situation, David replied to Gad. He says, this is desperate. I'm stuck. If you've been in a dire situation, you feel like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. You feel like there's nowhere to turn. It's just not going to go well for you. It's not a win-win. It's not a win-lose. It's a lose-lose situation you find yourself in. And maybe you've found yourself in that moment before. But this is David, and this is what he says, his reply. He says, but let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for His mercy is great. Do not let me fall into human hands. You know, when you normally feel like someone is not for you, you run to everyone else. Try to get some affirmation. Look how bad they are. Let's escape them and not be near them. He runs to the Lord because he knows his heart. But let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for His mercy is great. Do not let me fall into human hands. Desperate situation. That word means saw in the Hebrew. It means it's a tight, narrow, tied up. It feels like opponents crowding. It's a harassed place. That's where he finds himself in the midst of the moment. And maybe you've been in that, and that's the place where anxiety springs up. It's the place where stress starts to wear at you. It's the place where worry starts to appear. It's the place where maybe you feel that your sanity is being worn away at and eroded. And David finds he's wrestling with these various things happening, these thoughts, this fear, this anxiety. And literally he cries out like that dove's day to a father's strength who cares. Dove advert. He cries out, I'm in a desperate situation. I don't know what to do. But David's self-encouragement. You think, George, that got heavy on the last point. But no, this is encouragement. There's strength here. Just wait. We're going to see it in a moment. It's tucked away in the passage. You've got to open it up and see the beauty of it because it's hidden there for you. Verse 14, he says, I am in a desperate situation, David replied to Gad. But let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for His mercy is great. I love this. What he's saying is this, when the situation's bad, the diagnosis is bad, the job is lost, the friendship is gone, bankruptcy is seeming immediately, fall back into the hands of the Lord. You see, in every other context, falling back means losing ground. But when you fall back into the hands of the Lord, you're moving forward and being accelerated into all that He has for you. Fall back into the hands of the Lord, for His mercy is great. We see those two things that I was saying to reinforce. We see location and relationship. Let me fall into the hands of the Lord. Location, location, location. And then he goes to relationship, relationship, relationship. For His mercy is great. His mercy is abundant. His mercy is excessive. And this is a dire situation, but I believe His mercy can overwhelm it, overcome it, overflow it, can turn it around, that even though I feel weak, that strength will be the outcoming of this situation. I'm going to fall back so I can move forward in all that God has for me. You see, he's learned how to strengthen himself and encourage himself, not just for the moment, but for momentum in the purposes of God. So he pulls himself out of the dire situation, and he has that propensity to lean in, knowing this, that when it comes to the Lord, I'm in good hands. We're all facing different things. If I can ask you, where you're seeking encouragement, where you're finding discouragement, are you in a place where your desires just feel timing-wise not happening? Are you in a moment now when you're feeling that you're in a bit of distress because things aren't going your way? Are you feeling that things are dire and just my thoughts are all over the place? You've got a location to go, and you've got a loving Father who wants to give you strength because He cares for you. And it's that picture of my son Mitch saying, I know where I can find it. Won't be on YouTube, won't be on Facebook, won't be on a podcast, but you can find it in your Father who is for you, who is always good and loves to lavish you with who He is. Let me just pray for us at this time. If that's you, I just trust our good Father to minister to you in this moment. Lord, I just pray where there are people feeling out of time, where there are people that are feeling there's no way through, where there are people who are just thinking my thoughts are all over the place. Father, I thank you that you come and you just instill identity afresh, that you just speak courage into lives, that like as I got my little son Mitch and I took him and I started to declare things and put things into him, and pull lies away from them. I just thank you that you come and that you break things and the lie of the enemy of people today, and that you speak identity, courage, fortitude, purpose, destiny into lives. I pray that you give endurance for the waiting. I pray, Lord, that you give strength that they can make their way in you. And I pray, Lord, that you give them your thoughts, not only that they think your thoughts, but they know your thoughts for them, that they are greatly loved, celebrated, cherished, that you are for them. And Lord, because you've got them, they've got this, whatever this might be. So I bless them in Jesus' mighty name. Amen. I want to encourage one more thing for all the men here. I heard the story of Michelle and Barack Obama, and I'm not going to declare my political stance, but if you watch the documentary, it's a true story. It's based on the true story of the day that they went on their first date. And on this first date, by the end of the date, Michelle had enough. She didn't want to see Barack Obama again. And she, because he just spoke about how disappointed he was in his father. And so anyway, she looks him in the eyes at the end of this date, and she says to him, you need to get over your disappointment with your father. And he said, I can't. He never reached his potential. He never reached his destiny. And looking him in the eye, she said, fathers never do. That's why they have sons. So I want you to feel encouraged in that. It's a little bit different for us because we know that our Father's the one who instills destiny. But He's got sons and daughters, and He wants you to go and fulfill it and to bring Him glory. So go out encouraged, empowered, ready for Boerewors roles. And we'll hang out in a moment. If you're wanting to pray, we had some amazing testimonies from Pentecost Sunday of people being healed. We'll share those with you. We'd love to pray for you up front. We want to invite you to come and break bread. But the Lord bless you and your families, and look forward to seeing you outside.